All right, welcome everyone to today's session of the DBA Fundamentals presentation group. Today we're going to talk about what is Azure Arc-enabled Data Services. I know many of you have heard this topic and be like, I don't know anything about it. So today is your lucky day. We have Nikita to talk all about it, and we'll get to hear all of that goodness in just a second. As always, today is July 11th, 2023. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, you should be able to see the three leaders of the DBA Fundamentals group, Steve Cantrell, Shane O'Neill, and myself, Kevin Wilkie. To the right of our names, you'll see our Twitter handles so that you can actually easily get hold of us and have any questions you have. Below that, you can get to our social media, any of our social media platforms that we're on. First one up is Meetup, where we talk about, where we have all of our different meetings, so we can actually watch all goodness like this. There are several out there for the next several months that you can get onto to actually, so you can see us and hear more about all kinds of stuff DBA wise and database wise for a good long while to come. Below that one is one of my favorite websites, the dbafund.org site, where we have all of our past presentations as well as all of our future presentations as well. So please log on to that today and you'll see all kinds of goodness out there for that. Below that is my favorite video site, dbafundtube.com, where you can actually see all of our past presentations. And whenever I put this one out there, you'll be able to see this one as well. So when you go out there, be sure to actually like and subscribe to all of our videos so you can actually see it the moment it is put out there for viewage. Below that is some of our other social platforms, so we can actually be in contact with us and many others. Twitter, Slack, and LinkedIn, we have a decent presence on. As I said earlier, all our sessions are recorded and available usually within 1 to 2 days on my video channel, dbafundtube.com. As always, be sure to turn off your camera unless you're the presenter, wants to keep it on. And please be sure to mute yourself as well. This will just allow all of us to actually focus on what Nikita is saying here. Also, be sure to type any questions you have into our chat window, because we'll be monitoring that and we can go back and forth on how our goodness will respond for that one as well. As always, here is the bio for Nikita. I am sure she's got a much better slide on this one and whatnot, talking all about herself. So with that, over to Nikita.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Kevin, for the introduction. Very excited to be here today with everyone. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then we can go ahead and get started with our topic for today, which is we're going to discuss the topic of Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, which falls within data services as well. So quick introduction to get started. My name is Nikita Takru, and I'm a product manager in Microsoft's Azure data team. I specifically work on Azure Arc-enabled Data Services, which includes services like Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance, Azure Arc-enabled Postgres, and also Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. For today's session, what we'll be doing is a deep dive specifically on Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. And with that being said, we can go ahead and get started. Azure Arc is a bridge that really helps extend the Azure platform to help you build applications and services with the flexibility to run across data centers at the edge and also in multi-cloud environments. What it lets you do is develop cloud-native applications with a consistent development, operations, and security model. So at a high level, that's really what Arc is. Now let's take a look at what we're hearing and seeing today. If you look at many of the environments which are out there, it's very clear that they're continuing to grow in complexity with the influx of new technology and platform investments which are there. I'm sure this is something which rings true for you as well. You will notice that applications are running across diverse infrastructure with data centers, hosting environments, branch offices, as well as now multi-cloud scenarios. And multi-cloud is just where we're seeing 2 or more clouds being used. Now, to add to all of this complexity, teams are using different development tools, different languages, different frameworks, as well as different approaches like open source and Kubernetes and DevOps. At Microsoft, we've long understood this reality that you would be facing, and we designed Microsoft Azure with hybrid in mind from the beginning to help you meet these challenges. Key questions that I often hear when I meet with folks like yourself are, how do I govern and secure resources seamlessly, regardless of where they're running? How do you bring cloud innovation to existing infrastructure? How do you modernize local data centers with new cloud infrastructure? And at the same time, how can you really extend compute and AI to the edge to unlock new business scenarios? So these are some of the things that we are seeing today. Now let's dive deeper into Azure Arc. Azure Arc offers 2 deployment options. One is you can connect your hybrid resources to Azure as if they're native Azure resources. And the second option is you can actually bring Azure services to your own infrastructure. In both cases, you're able to manage, secure, and protect from Azure and operate directly from Azure as well. And we'll see some of this in action today too. Now that we have a good high-level understanding of what is Azure Arc, let's specifically talk about Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server and really understand what that is. So Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server extends Azure services to SQL Server instances, which are hosted outside of Azure. So this could be in your data center, in edge site locations like a retail store. It could be in any public cloud or hosting provider. The 3 big benefits that you're getting with Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server is you can 1, inventory your systems, 2, you can leverage Microsoft Defender, and 3, you can also leverage the best practices assessment. Today, what we'll be doing is doing a deep dive into each one of these 3 capabilities and also seeing it in action. So how all of this works in the Azure portal and how you can really use Azure to see all of these pieces. But before we go and talk about each of those capabilities in depth and see it in action, it's really good to talk about the architecture for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server at a high level so that you understand how it works behind the scenes. So let's talk about the architecture for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. It all starts with you have a virtual machine or a physical machine that's running somewhere. You have some SQL Server instances now, which are running on that machine. The first step is to Arc-enable your server. What this means is you're going to go into the operating system level and install something that we call the Arc agent. That Arc agent is the equivalent of in infrastructure as a software or the IaaS agent. What this agent does is it will actually discover the SQL Server instances which are running on that box. That then signals to Azure that there are some SQL servers here, which should be Arc-enabled. And then the extension for SQL Server will automatically be installed on the Arc agent. And what you will see is now the SQL Server instances will be back up into Azure and reflected as resources there. What that then allows you to do is decide what features you want to turn on. So some of these capabilities that I was mentioning earlier, like the SQL Best Practices Assessment, or Microsoft Defender, or basic updates. These are all things that you can then light up directly from Azure as well. So some of these features, I should point out, also depend on something that we call the Azure Monitoring Agent. which is running alongside here. And what this Azure monitoring agent does is it actually sends up the data to the log analytics, to Azure Log Analytics. And over time, these agent extensions that we're talking about and the agent itself will be automatically updated. And what this means is it actually has things like bug fixes, new capabilities which we're adding, and all of this comes to you as part of the monthly releases that we have. And you can control what extensions you want installed if you want automatic upgrade. So you still get all of the control that you would like. All of this communication then goes back to Azure using port 443 with HTTPS and TLS certificate communication. So really, now that we've looked at that as a whole, it really boils down into 4 main steps, just to recap and summarize the architecture. First is we Arc-enable the server resource. Then we Arc-enable the SQL server. And from there, you can actually use the services, right? Things like the best practices assessment, Microsoft Defender, basic updates, being able to do things like patching, so on and so forth. And then you have the option to also enable at scale. Now that we've talked about the architecture, let's actually dive a little bit deeper into Arc-enabled SQL Server. So using Arc, what we're doing is we are bringing more Azure data manageability to SQL Server on premises in a multi-cloud environment for you. The 3 capabilities that we hear folks care the most about are management, governance, and security for their SQL Server workloads. And Arc is really bringing that to the next level. With Arc, what you can do is you can manage all of the SQL Server estate using Azure. What this then allows you to do is have a single view of all of your SQL servers in a central portal where you can better manage inventory, licenses, and also light up features like the SQL Best Practices Assessment, where you can automatically evaluate things like SQL Server performance, security, scalability, business continuity, and more. For governance, we also have enabled Microsoft Purview access policies for SQL Server through Arc. So you can control and govern the entire data estate and generate central insights through that method. And then finally, now when we look at the third aspect, which is security, we have Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which does things like threat protection for your SQL servers and has single sign-on with Azure Active Directory for these as well. So we've kept all of those pieces in mind. Now, what we're going to do from here is actually do a deep dive into each of those 3 areas and key capabilities that Arc and Arc-enabled SQL Server bring to you specifically. So I'm sure you've all wondered, would it be possible if I could quickly inventory and view my SQL Server databases in Azure? Well, I'm happy to tell you that this is possible. And what we're going to do now is take a look at what this means, but also see it in action in the portal and how it works. So let's talk about inventorying. With Arc-enabled SQL Server, you're getting a single consistent view of all of your SQL servers, which are deployed on premises, at the edge, and also in multi-cloud scenarios. We have inventory and tag management using Resource Graph, thus allowing you to increase the visibility across your entire data estate. You have the power to now be able to quickly query and generate insights across all of your SQL servers which are there. And then you can also manage things like licenses, right? And compare them with the procurement state as well. But instead of just talking about inventorying, let's now see it in action and understand how all of this works together. So now let's take a look. If you could manage all of your SQL servers at scale from a single point of control, how does this work with Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server? Basically, what you will notice is right now I'm in the Azure portal, and this is a single place that I can view this detailed inventory for my SQL servers and databases. I'm inside of the Azure portal, and you'll see I have a SQL Server Azure Arc resource up and running. Now, what you'll notice here is there's actually a Databases tab on the left. If I go ahead and I click on this Databases tab, it will go ahead and show me all of the databases associated from here. Now you can do things like quickly search across all of those databases if you have one you're trying to look for specifically, as you might have hundreds of databases. So in this case, I'm searching for master. Now I'll go ahead and click on that. And what you will notice is you can generate insights from here. These are pieces which are useful for reporting and inventorying. So you'll see we have a properties section. And this is something you may have normally seen in SQL Server Management Studio or SSMS, these different properties. And what you'll see is if I want to see, is the database read-only? Is, backups or auto shrink on? All of these different properties you can now see inside of Azure. And what the power of this is, you can go to Azure Resource Graph Explorer, which we're going to now, and you can leverage those properties that we just viewed earlier in the portal to generate rich and powerful insights about your SQL Server. So let's run some of these queries together to get an understanding of how this works. So in this first scenario, I want to actually query and find out, I want to run 10 databases, get 10 databases and return the properties which are available to query. So I'll put this inside and go ahead in Azure Resource Graph Explorer. And then you'll see here that we have a Run Query button on that top. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click on that Run Query button, and it will execute in a few seconds. And now you can see all of the properties that you could use for inventory and reporting, which is very helpful to see. So you can see we have the different properties here that we had seen earlier. But let's take a look at a second query and run it together. Now in this scenario, I want to get all of the databases which are not encrypted. Once again, I'm going to press the Run Query button in Azure Resource Graph Explorer, and it's going to return to me all of those databases which are not encrypted. And I have my list here. Very quickly, scanning across my entire estate. Let's take a look at another example. Here, I want to actually get and show the SQL Server version distribution. So once I have this, I'll press Run Query. And what you will notice is here, I can access all of the different versions. And that's the power of Azure Resource Graph Explorer. It also lets you do things like create charts. So if I pop over here, what you'll notice is now I have a very nice chart that I can see, which is showing me the different versions of the SQL Server. This is something which can be used in reporting, inventorying purposes. You can also make a bar chart. There are lots of different types of charts and options that you can make, and you can pin it to a dashboard from there as well and see all of your resources with that method. Finally, let's take a look at just one more example after this of what you can do with the database properties. In this scenario, I want to get all the databases in the West US 3 location, which have a compatibility level of 160. I'll go ahead and press the Run Query button. And what you will notice here is that I have very quickly actually gone ahead and pulled all of those different databases through this method. And what you will notice is this is really what Azure Resource Graph Explorer allows you to do. It lets you look at your entire data estate and also generate rich and powerful insights that are useful for reporting and inventory. All of these properties are ones that you can access in Azure in the portal like we had just seen earlier. You can scan across all of your databases. You can see the properties for individual databases, and you can use Azure Resource Graph Explorer to quickly look at, whatever you want to query and find insights about across your entire estate. So this is the first piece that I wanted to talk about, is the inventorying scenario. But it goes beyond inventorying. So earlier I had talked a little bit about the best practices assessment being one of the other tools that you are able to leverage with Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. So now let's do the same thing with the best practices assessment. Let's start by understanding what it is and then seeing it in action in the portal and how you can leverage that. So now let's talk about the best practices assessment. The best practices assessment provides a mechanism to evaluate the configuration of your SQL Server. After you enable the best practices assessment, what happens is the assessment is actually scanning your SQL Server instances and databases to provide you recommendations for things like SQL Server and database configurations, index management, deprecated features, enabled or missing trace flag, statistics, and more. So what it's doing is it's actually helping you scan in intervals for the most up-to-date results. And this really empowers DBAs to proactively address any risks and increase operational stability while reducing these workloads. And what you'll notice here is I actually have a picture of how that best practices assessment looks like in Azure. And now what we're going to do is take a look at this in action in the portal, just like we did for inventory. So let's really see how this works. Now let's take a look at the SQL Server Best Practices Assessment. So at a high level, the Best Practices Assessment is providing you with a way to evaluate the configuration of your SQL Server. Once you enable this Best Practices Assessment, it will let you scan your SQL Server instances and databases, and it will provide recommendations for those things I was mentioning earlier, like the index management, statistics, so on and so forth. But now let's really take a look at how this works in the Azure portal. So what you will notice is I have a SQL Server Azure Arc resource up and running. Once again, you will see there's a best practices assessment tab. So just like we had seen the databases under database data management earlier, we can go ahead and click on best practices assessment for this scenario. What you will notice when I click on this is it will give me all of this different information. You can actually run the assessment as well, and it will complete with the latest updates for you. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to show you one that was completed in the past, and we can take a look at what that looks like. So I'll go ahead and click on this one. And what you will notice here is that it has scanned across my entire data estate, and it's telling me about the issues which are present. You will notice that I have quite a few here, right? So you can see that it's passed for 93.9%, and I have 369 passed, but I have some medium and low issues, 8 to 10, right? So now let's take a look and understand what are these medium and these low issues. If you scroll down, and we'll scroll down here together, you will actually see the severity too of the issue. It's medium, low, or high. The tags related to the issue are also shown, and if you want to mitigate it, we will give you steps here as well for the solution for that. Let's go ahead and click on this first one together, and let's see what it tells me, right? So if I actually go ahead and I take a look at the first one here, what you will see is that I have these 4, which are all of medium severity. And it will tell me a description of that issue. So it's helpful if you want to take action proactively. Similarly, if you want to see a low issue and we click on that one, you will see the database that's associated with that along with a helpful link, which will help you mitigate and resolve the issue quickly. You can also see in your best practices assessment what are the new issues. So if we go to this tab here, I can see I have 1 medium and 1 low. And you can go ahead and click inside and see the message, again, with a helpful link in terms of how can I resolve this issue. The goal is really to make sure that all of your SQL servers are in a healthy state with this best practices assessment. As a DBA, this tool can be very useful and will help you save time and make processes more efficient as well. So this is how the best practices assessment works as a whole. And it's something that you can also do at scale, and you can schedule the assessments too. We have a Microsoft documentation page where you can find additional details on this SQL Server best practices assessment too. With that being said, let's go ahead and now look at the third scenario. So far we have looked at inventorying. Now we've looked at the best practices assessment. And now let's talk about how you can secure your systems with Microsoft Defender for Arc-enabled SQL Server. Once again, we're first going to start out by talking about what is Microsoft Defender, and then seeing it in action in the Azure portal as well. Some common questions which I often hear, right, when talking to folks like yourself is, why is database threat protection important? Databases, right, can be at risk. They contain business critical information and sensitive data, and that can make them targets for, any kind of piece in that sense. So that's where Microsoft Defender for Cloud comes in. Microsoft Defender for Cloud really offers a comprehensive hybrid and multi-cloud solution for protecting and all of your different SQL servers which are there. So this goes from reducing, overall attacks, detecting threats, and also responding to those attacks proactively. What we're going to do now is similarly, we're going to take a look at how Microsoft Defender works in action in the Azure portal. So let's go ahead and now hop over and take a look at Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So what you will notice is in the Azure portal, just like we saw databases and the best practices assessment, we also have that Microsoft Defender for Cloud tab as well on the left. And on a high level, Microsoft Defender for Cloud is going in, checking for any security threats in the Azure Security Center, and it's going to return to you information for recommendations for any specific threats which are out there. So you'll notice here we have that security section in the portal. If we go ahead and we click on it, you will notice that it's going to scan and tell me that I have 5 recommendations here, which are potential threats, and it has listed those for me and the severity as well, whether it's medium, low, or high. So you can see I have 1 low, I have 2 high, and 2 medium severity recommendations. So one of these says, I should have the machines to be configured, right, to periodically check for these missing updates. So let's go ahead and click on this to see what happens if I want to look for a potential solution to mitigate this threat specifically. So if I go ahead and I click inside, what you will see is it will tell me the severity, that it's high, and it will give me a recommendation for how I can mitigate this as well. It also will tell me that 5 out of my 7 resources are affected, besides just giving the recommendation. So if I click on it, you will see the resources that are in that unhealthy state. 2 here, right, are in healthy state. And what this allows you to do is really click within and notice how you can quickly fix the issue. And that's where the power of Defender comes. It'll give me, what can you do as a quick fix? What is a manual process? This is one example. Now, if we actually go back, we can see another scenario too. So now let's look at one of the vulnerabilities in the security configuration for the Windows machine. Now, if we click inside of this, what will happen is we will see a description, again, of what is the issue, like we did earlier. You can see I have, 293 affected resources. And if I click inside of that, it will show me how I can do a quick fix or a manual fix, just like we had seen earlier. So at a high level, this is the goal of what we're trying to achieve, right, with Microsoft Defender for Cloud and Arc-enabled SQL Server. We want to make sure that these resources are in a healthy state and that there are no security threats for your data estate. If there are some, then we will give you recommendations so you don't have to worry about, manually going in, as this is an automated process and you can quickly come in and the security team can take a look and mitigate the threats as soon as possible. So now we have taken a look at the main three pieces that Arc-enabled SQL Server really allows you to do. So we saw inventorying, we talked about the best practices assessment, and also Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And with that being said, as you can see, there is no reason not to get started with Arc-enabled SQL Server. I put a list of resources here that you can use to continue your journey to learn about this exciting product offering. And what we really had a chance to talk about today is, what is Azure Arc? What is Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server? And then all of those different pieces, right? So things like the architecture and also the best practices assessment, inventory, and Defender. So hopefully this is useful and you learned something today. It's been wonderful talking to all of you. And Kevin, I'll hand it back to you now. If anyone has questions, we can definitely go through those as well. You can feel free to add them in the chat. I'll also go ahead and put my email in the chat if anyone wants to connect and ask questions there as well. So.
All right, so as always, we have a great group of bunch that actually put our questions into the chat window to start with. So question, does Azure Arc work for Azure SQL databases and databases on managed instance?
Yeah, great question. So within Azure Arc-enabled Data Services, we have three different products, which I had talked about earlier. We talked about Arc-enabled SQL Server, but we also have two others. One of them is called Azure Arc-enabled Managed Instance. And actually what that lets you do is a similar scenario where you can have managed instance in the hybrid and multi-cloud environment. So what I will do is actually put in Azure Arc-enabled Managed Instance in the chat if you want to learn more about it in the documentation. One thing I also want to point out, one difference, this is just useful to know about Arc-enabled SQL Server and managed instances, Azure Arc-enabled Managed Instance is based on Kubernetes. So the way that it works from an architectural level to understand is you bring your Kubernetes cluster as a prerequisite. Then you're able to get something that we call the Azure Arc-enabled Data Controller, which essentially acts as a control plane. So it's similar as a control plane concept in Kubernetes. And then you have your Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance on top of that. And then you have access to all of the management capabilities as well. So I've added that link in the chat. If you want to learn more about managed instance, definitely feel free to send me an email after reading that if you have more questions, and I'd be happy to discuss that more in depth too.
Awesome. See, I don't see any more questions out here. So as always, please, if y'all have any questions, please take the time now to actually put your questions into the chat.
And I'll also put my email in the chat too. So if anyone has questions that you think about later or anything you're curious about, if you're going through these different resources that I put here in documentation, or if you're spinning up resources in Azure just to test and learn, you can definitely send me an email and I will get back to you on that too.
Awesome. Well, while y'all are thinking about your questions and typing them quickly into the chat window, I want to remind everyone that we do have some upcoming presentations on DBA Fundamentals channel. On July 25th, we have Divide and Conquer partitioning with Stuart Moore. So if you have any questions around partitioning, now would be the time to go to that and learn all kinds of goodness, because we all need to get better with partitioning, when to use it, when not to use it, why does it work, how does it work, what does it do for you, all kinds of goodness. And then on August 22nd, we have Josephine Bush talking about handling Azure SQL auditing with ease. Do you have any questions around auditing? And I am sure we all do. That'd be the time to go to that one. Get all kinds of goodness for that. So with that, doesn't look like any more questions are coming in, but as always, this has been very helpful. I have learned enough that I want to learn more about Azure Arc Studio. So that's always a good start. If you find stuff you want to learn more about, then that's always a good jumping off spot. So with that, I do thank you all. Ms. Nikita, thank you so much for giving out this goodness. It has been a pleasure to see all. So with that, thank you all. Have a great day, a great week, and we will see you all soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. It was wonderful talking to everyone today. So thank you all for joining.